The Oxford Dictionary defines a world war as a war involving many large nations in all different parts of the world. Today, we commonly associate the term with the Great War of 1914 to 1918 and the Second World War of 1939 to 1945. The effects these two conflicts have had on history is almost beyond measure. The Second World War especially, which has become known as the deadliest war in human history, and culminated in 2 nuclear attacks. With this in mind, many have pondered just what a Third World War would look like, and how it would affect the course of human history. Most people agree that a Third World War would overshadow both of its predecessors combined, in terms of destruction and death, because such a conflict would almost certainly involve nuclear weapons. At present, there are around 1,500 nuclear warheads of varying destructive power across the globe, and while this is significantly lower than the 70,000 plus warheads at the height of the Cold War, it's still enough to devastate the planet to such an extent that human life itself could possibly be extinguished. This fact has caused such an alarm within the scientific community that members of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists Science and Security Board have maintained a clock since 1947 which symbolises how close we are to our own destruction. Known as the Doomsday Clock, it takes into account world events, military technology, and even climate change. In 2017, the minute hand was moved forward 30 seconds. We now stand at 2.5 minutes to midnight, the point of Armageddon. But just how did we get here? On September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese government finally surrendered to the Allied powers of Britain, the British Commonwealth, China, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Germany had surrendered over 4 months earlier, and now the world breathed a sigh of relief that World War II was over. However, behind closed doors, the victorious Allies were already eyeing each other with suspicion. Britain and the United States had not forgotten that before they were invaded by the Nazis, the Soviets under the paranoid Joseph Stalin had collaborated with Hitler in conquering Poland in 1939. They also feared Stalin's desire to spread communism across the world, with the Soviet Union at the centre. This fear seemed to be reinforced when, at the Yalta Conference before the war ended, the Western Allies had to agree to effectively hand over control of Eastern Europe to Stalin. These countries, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany, became Soviet client states, becoming under the control of Moscow. West Germany was initially split between the US, UK, and France, before being granted the right to self-rule. But it was across this newly created border in Germany that the former Allies began to square up to one another. Winston Churchill spoke at Westminster College in Missouri, saying that across Europe an iron curtain was falling. Over the next 4 decades, both power blocs would wrestle for dominance over the political landscape of the globe. Initially, the Soviet Union was at a disadvantage since it lacked its own atomic weapons, but on August 29, 1949, Stalin was informed of the successful tests of the RDS-1 atomic bomb, the communist world's first nuclear weapon. The test was made possible largely thanks to captured German research and spies operating close to the United States' own Manhattan Project. Thus, the first nuclear arms race began, and both sides worked to build more and powerful weapons, but perhaps even more importantly, faster ways to deliver them. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had suffered devastating surprise attacks in World War II, and they were both determined not to be victims of such attacks again. Therefore, they worked to develop nuclear weapons that could be deployed quickly, so they would not get destroyed in the first wave of a surprise attack. This generated a level of fear in either side that they could not possibly attack the other side without incurring huge losses themselves in retaliation. At first, they used long-range bombers, but these took several minutes to take off and hours to reach their targets, allowing ample time for the enemy to detect and destroy them. They were also becoming increasingly vulnerable to more sophisticated defences, such as supersonic missile-armed interceptors and surface-to-air missiles. They therefore turned to rocketry to carry the nuclear weapons across continents. Suddenly, the time it took to retaliate to an attack dropped from hours to just a few minutes, and the rockets were extremely difficult to shoot down. This level of efficiency with which to destroy one another effectively contained them on their respective sides of the Iron Curtain, because they knew if they upset the balance, then the result would be mutually assured destruction, known appropriately as MAD. This didn't stop them from fighting a series of proxy wars against one another, however, through third parties. Essentially, wars would break out with one side supported by the Soviet Union and the other side by the West. Whichever side won the war was seen as a victory for their respective supporter. Examples of this include the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s. The Cold War officially ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the reunification of Germany without World War III itself breaking out. But while the speed in which both sides would retaliate with missiles actually kept them from fighting directly, it also increased the odds of an accidental war being started due to a malfunction or human error. The technology being used to detect incoming missiles was sometimes prone to atmospheric interference that resulted in false images, such as happened in 1983 when the Soviets detected 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles being fired at them. It transpired that reflected sunlight confused a Soviet satellite. Potentially even more serious was an incident in 1980 when a faulty computer chip made US commanders believe that 2,000 Soviet missiles had been fired at them. They were just seconds from retaliating when the mistake was realized. Perhaps most worryingly for the future, the closest humanity ever came to nuclear Armageddon occurred after the Cold War had ended, when on January 25th, 1995, Norwegian scientists launched a research rocket to study Aurora Borealis. They had warned Moscow, but the message had not gone through, and Russian President Boris Yeltsin was handed the Russian nuclear briefcase, which controlled their entire nuclear arsenal, and was told that NATO had launched a Trident nuclear missile at them. It was only Yeltsin's refusal to fire that saved humanity, and so far remains the only time in history a leader has been one button away from launching a full nuclear strike. Given this fact, we must ask ourselves if the threat of World War III and a nuclear exchange is really over in the 21st century. The reality is, the threat will most probably never be fully removed. The number of nuclear weapons in the world has indeed fallen, but the number of countries possessing them has increased. According to a 2016 report published by the Plowshares Fund, a group dedicated to reducing the world's nuclear arsenal, 9 countries now possess a combined total of around 14,900 warheads. From the largest arsenals to the smallest, they are Russia, the United States, China, France, the United Kingdom, Pakistan, India, Israel, and finally North Korea with an estimated 15 warheads. What's even more worrying is that China, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea are all located in regions where there are ideological and territorial disputes currently underway. In 1991, during the Gulf War, the US-led coalition forces amassed against Iraq included a number of Arab countries who were hostile to Israel. Saddam Hussein knew that if Israel joined in the war, then Arab support from the US would collapse, and so he launched his Scud missiles at the small Jewish country in an attempt to provoke them. While the US and UK managed to convince the Israelis to hold off from attacking Iraq, the Israelis took the protective tops off their nuclear missile silos to convince all they were serious about defending their country. Iraq itself had been working on developing the means with which to develop nuclear energy, and in turn nuclear weapons during the early 1980s. Israel launched one of the most daring airstrikes in history in 1981 on the Iraq Issarak reactor, thus destroying Saddam's nuclear program for good. Had they not carried out the attack, then the coalition forces that confronted him after his invasion of Kuwait in 1990 could have faced a nuclear-armed Iraq. In recent years, Israel has also had to contend with the threat of Iran developing nuclear weapons. Several suspicious deaths of Iranian scientists have actually been blamed on Israeli agents trying to curtail their efforts. The disputed Kashmir region exists between China, India, and Pakistan, and has led to several clashes that continue to this day. made worse by the rise of tribal fighting and terrorism. In 1999, India and Pakistan clashed over the Kargil district of the region for several months, during which time both sides readied their nuclear arsenal in case of a sudden escalation of the conflict. China has been expanding as a nuclear superpower in the last 20 years, and its forces are no longer confined to the Asian continent, with Chinese warships carrying out anti-piracy operations in Africa and troops training in Latin America. China is one of a number of countries laying claim to the Spratly Islands, including Japan and Taiwan, both of which view China as a threat. The situation has escalated in recent years due to China's increasingly vocal claims to the islands and their opposition to US and Japanese warships training in the region, something they claim is proactive. Finally, and perhaps most seriously, is the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Divided along the 50th parallel, the communist North Korea and the democratic South Korea have eyed each other across the border with deep suspicion for over 60 years, since the end of the Korean War. North Korea is perhaps the most closed country in the world, not just regarding its border, but its culture as well. The government control almost every aspect of the people's lives by overwhelming them with Communist Party doctrine and propaganda, much of which is aimed at portraying the US and their South Korean allies as a force bent on their destruction. With such a prevailing mentality, the current North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, has worked to build up the country's armed forces to include land-based and submarine-launched nuclear missiles, much to the world's alarm. North Korea officially became a nuclear power on October 9, 2006, when it detonated a small nuclear device underground at the Punggye-ri test site in the northeast of the country. The yield was less than 1 kiloton, leading some experts to suggest that this first test was actually a misfire. However, since then, North Korea has tested more and more powerful weapons, culminating in what experts believe was a 25 to 30 kiloton device detonated on September 9, 2016. Such a device, detonated over a densely populated city like Tokyo, New York, or South Korea's capital, could devastate somewhere in the region of 14 square kilometers and inflict over 500,000 casualties. North Korea's ability to deliver such weapons has always been the source of both speculation and concern. The country's scientists have long had experience with rocketry, thanks to weapons such as the Scud missile imported from China and the Soviet Union, and these have been adapted and developed for North Korea's nuclear program. The issue North Korean scientists have had to contend with is developing a reliable missile and a sturdy enough warhead to survive the incredible forces placed upon it during the flight that would take it to the edge of space. North Korea has reportedly claimed to have addressed these problems and even tested a missile capable of reaching the west coast of the continental United States. In January 2017, Donald Trump became the President of the United States, and this marked the rapid deterioration in relations between North Korea and the rest of the world, prompting them to increase their weapons testing program as a warning against the US launching a preemptive strike. In August 2017, North Korea warned that any direct American hostile action against them would see them fire a nuclear missile at the strategically important US base on Guam. This threat was made in response to President Trump warning that North Korea would face fire and fury, the likes of which the world has never seen, if they continue to develop weapons with which to threaten the US. North Korea has shown no signs of stopping its test program, and seems more intent than ever in pursuing its nuclear weapons program. On August 28, 2017, they tested a missile that actually flew over Japan, prompting local authorities there to issue warnings to the population. The addition of continental-range nuclear missiles to the North Korean arsenal has turned what was a regional dispute into a potential World War-scale scenario. So with that in mind, let's step through the looking glass and see how just one World War III scenario could develop, and how it might impact you and your loved ones. The date is tomorrow morning. You awaken on a typical day like so many others, and as you get ready to go to school, college, or to work, you put the television on. the news mentions that in North Korea, President Kim Jong-un has executed a number of his closest advisors after a failed uprising. You take only a passing notice in this event, taking place thousands of miles away, unaware that it will soon change your life and indeed the world. What you don't know is that Kim Jong-un is convinced that South Korea and the United States is responsible for organising the uprising and sends thousands of troops to the border as a warning. Over the coming days, the United States responds by deploying a number of its warships into the Sea of Japan and reinforcing its troops in South Korea. Japan, France and the United Kingdom support the US, but this military reinforcement alarms nearby China, who are in turn supported by Russia. Kim Jong-un refuses to back down, pledging to defend North Korea's way of life. While at the United Nations, a fierce war of words breaks out at the Security Council, which is divided into two camps. Like the US, neither China or Russia are actually on the side of North Korea, but oppose any US actions on the Korean peninsula, which may further destabilize the region, or in the event of a US military victory, turn North Korea into a US ally positioned on the border with China. On TV and the internet, the propaganda war is already in full swing. Russian media sources based in the West, such as Russia Today, begin pumping alternative Russian news stories regarding the situation, in an attempt to spread dissent in the West and encourage criticism of US policy. This has an unintended side effect of making Kim Jong-un even more paranoid, as he is presented with these anti-US news stories. With a massive fleet of US, British, French and South Korean ships off the coast of his country, Kim warns that he will use his nuclear missiles to defend himself. The threat falls on deaf ears, so he decides to conduct a missile test to prove that he has the capability to do as he has threatened. The missile is launched in the direction of the American fleet, who are unaware that it is a test, and fire anti-ballistic missiles at it, shooting it down. Unsure if the missile was armed or not, the US president orders his fleet to fire Tomahawk land attack missiles at the base where the missile was launched, to prevent them from attacking again. Believing the war has begun, Kim orders his forces along the border to start shelling American and South Korean ground forces. The Second Korean War has now broken out. The North Koreans put up a fierce defence, but their older and less sophisticated weaponry proved no match for the US and their allies, who start to push the North Koreans back. The US, British and South Koreans send ground troops into the north to pursue the North Korean army. In the skies above, the North Korean Air Force is destroyed, and American planes and drones begin searching for Kim's nuclear missiles. But they cannot find them, as they have been hidden away in a complex series of caves. The Chinese deploy their fleet to counter the US fleet and protect Chinese maritime interests in the region. They also place their armed forces on a high state of alert in case the fighting spills over into China itself. After 2 months of fighting, North Korea is on the verge of collapse, with Kim's army only able to slow down the US and their allies, but not stop them. Deep in his bunker, Kim's mental state deteriorates. The North Korean world he was once the absolute centre of is now crumbling around him, and he can feel a noose tightening around his neck, as he views all of his staff with suspicion, believing they will move against him if he doesn't reverse his fortunes. He knows he only has one card left to play: his nuclear weapons. He only has 15 of them, so he selects that number of high priority targets, such as the American carrier groups that have encircled the Korean peninsula, the US Army headquarters at Yongsan in South Korea, and even a number of locations in his own country that have a high number of enemy troops based there, or have an active runway being used by Allied aircraft to resupply their forces. The nuclear-armed missiles are moved quickly out of their hideouts because of the threat from enemy aircraft. Kim orders that every available missile is to be fired, even those without nuclear warheads, these serving as decoys to distract defences. The missiles rise into the air, and the US president is informed that Kim is carrying out a nuclear strike. Given the short distances Kim's missiles have to travel to their targets, would have lost thousands of service personnel within 5 minutes of launching. Despite the density of the anti-ballistic missile defences of the US Navy, they are not able to destroy all of the warheads, and a carrier along with a number of destroyers are lost. several thousand North Koreans are also killed as their own nuclear weapons land on their territory. The Pentagon would have by now formulated a plan of action for this scenario, which would include retaliating against suspected locations of more nuclear weapons. The US cannot take the risk that Kim has more weapons the world does not know about, and would have to launch their own nuclear weapons against these areas to guarantee their destruction, even though in reality they would be blasting empty caves or silos. The US weapons detonate so close to the North Korea-Chinese border that the electromagnetic pulses generated by the detonations shuts down nearby Chinese radars and hampers communications, leading China to believe they may have been attacked. The Chinese warn their navy of an impending attack just as a flight of US Navy planes trying to find a surviving carrier to land on approach them. The Chinese ship thinks this is an attack and lock their weapon radars on the American planes, who retaliate with anti-radar missiles. The US lose 2 planes in the ensuing exchange of fire, whilst a Chinese warship is damaged. At this point, the United Nations is effectively a non-entity. Nobody can even agree on just what has happened in North Korea, and the Sea of Japan to say nothing of reaching an agreement on what to do next. Russia is especially vocal, blaming the US for starting a war that has resulted in hundreds of thousands of dead, and the irradiation of millions of Koreans and Chinese. Fearing an escalation, Russia goes on to a war footing, prompting NATO to do the same. The world's economy begins tumbling out of control, leading to rioting and food shortages in South America, Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. Russia also halts gas supplies to Europe in protest. Unable to pull back for fear of losing whatever diplomatic leverage was left, the US stands firm and warns of more attacks if Kim does not surrender. China and Russia warn that they will not stand for any more nuclear weapons being used in the Second Korean War. In just over 2 months, the world as you know it has already ended, but the worst is yet to come as the world braces itself for what is known as an inevitable global confrontation. Neither side can stand down at this point. They can only go further towards the abyss. Around the globe, several world leaders will have their fingers resting on the nuclear button, and one of them will push it. The attack. The first missiles launched would come from the sea, fired by ballistic missile submarines. The missiles would race into the sky, upon which time they would be detected by the opposing side on radar, and who would then scramble to get their own weapons into the air. The submarine-launched weapons would take just a few minutes to reach their targets, meaning it's unlikely the general population would receive any warning of the attack. And even if they did, there would be almost no time to do anything to protect themselves. The first nuclear detonations would occur at a very high altitude, resulting in a series of electromagnetic pulses that would wipe out electrical and communication equipment, including wireless sets such as radios and mobile phones. This is designed to hamper the ability for the target country to respond, but they would have their own submarine-based missiles either launching or being made ready, and these would not be affected. In under an hour, the planet would be subjected to the greatest level of destruction in recorded human history, it being many times greater than World War I and II combined. The worst hit areas of the globe would be Europe, Central and Southeastern Asia, Japan, South Australia, and large areas of North America, especially in the northeast of the United States and around New York and Washington. The majority of targets would be military bases, power stations, centres of government, industrial areas and harbours. Unfortunately, due to the sheer power of the nuclear weapons used, the destruction would extend many miles beyond the target. If we consider the effects of an attack on Nellis Air Force Base, one of the biggest bases in the continental US, we begin to understand just how powerful these weapons can be. If the base was hit with a 340 kiloton warhead, a relatively small weapon, people up to 8 kilometers away in North Las Vegas would suffer horrendous, certainly fatal burns. Thousands of others further out as far as McCarran International Airport would be blinded and burned to varying degrees. In the UK, there would be almost nowhere to hide. There is such a density of potential targets in Britain that much of England, coastal Wales and southern Scotland would be turned to ashes. 24 hours after the attack, the last nuclear weapons would likely be expended by any submarines that had survived thus far. In the US alone, around 160 million people would already be dead. Compare this to the 60 million killed in all theatres of World War II. Hundreds of thousands of miles would be on fire, sending millions of tons of dense black smoke into the air, blocking out the sun. With no possibility of tackling these fires, then they would likely continue to burn for weeks, even months after the attack, until they exhausted their fuel sources. Fire continued to burn at ground zero of the World Trade Center after 9/11 for 100 days, and that was with a well-orchestrated fire and rescue operation in place. Much of the northern hemisphere would be plunged into darkness under this cloud, leading to a drop in temperature as great as 20 to 30 degrees centigrade below normal. This nuclear winter could potentially last years, and as well as create a freezing climate, it would also inhibit the ability of plants to achieve the photosynthesis necessary for survival. Huge areas of potential farmland would die out, which would in turn kill off countless species of animals. Despite not being the focus of the nuclear exchange, the southern hemisphere would be affected by the nuclear winter too, as the clouds circled the globe and spread out. South America, Africa and Australia could expect temperature drops in the region of 10 to 15 degrees centigrade. Worryingly, scientists predict that even a limited regional nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan would lower the Earth's temperature by several degrees. But perhaps the most sinister threat of nuclear war lingers for potentially years after the weapons detonate: nuclear fallout. Fallout consists of particles that are irradiated as they are hurled into the air by the detonation of a nuclear bomb. These particles can either come from the weapon itself or from debris sucked up in the blast, and can be spread over huge areas as they fall back to the surface. The threat from fallout comes from the effect exposure has on the body biologically, which takes place on the genetic level and is dictated by the materials used in the weapon's construction. These materials then form dangerous isotopes as a result of the nuclear blast. Strontium-90, for example, is a radioactive isotope of the element strontium that acts similar to calcium when ingested in the body and is absorbed by bone tissue. Its presence in the body can lead to formation of bone cancer, tumours and leukemia, as well as blood abnormalities. These effects can take years to manifest themselves, leaving a person unaware of their exposure without thorough medical examinations. Strontium-90 escapes from the damaged reactors at both Chernobyl and Fukushima. In the former case, it's been identified as being the leading cause of health problems surrounding workers and residents around the power station in Ukraine. Other deadly isotopes contained within fallout include iodine-131, which can destroy the thyroid gland, which affects your body's ability to create hormones that regulate cell function. Plutonium-239 is another, and even a minute amount entering the body can cause bone and lung tumours to form. Unlike the immediate devastation brought about by the bomb's detonation, fallout would continue to pose a threat to human survival long after the war has ended. Iodine-131 has a lifespan of just over 2 weeks, but strontium-90 could remain a threat for up to 50 years after the blast that created it. Plutonium-239 has just a half-life of a staggering 24,000 years, and this is one of the reasons people will not be allowed to live in the town of Pripyat for millennia to come. If you were lucky enough to survive in a rural and secluded area when the nuclear missiles landed, what would be your future? Any survivors of a nuclear holocaust would face the most difficult survival scenario in human history. Traditional Darwinism implies that life is a case of survival of the fittest, but this would likely not be enough in the wake of this man-made catastrophe, for knowledge would be as great a tool as any weapon. For any survivors, the immediate order of business would be to identify where the nearest weapons detonated, and then try to ascertain which way the wind was carrying the smoke and clouds, in an effort to limit the level of exposure to concentrated amounts of fallout particles. But make no mistake, unless you have a protective suit or live in a fully independent bunker, then you will almost certainly be exposed to some level of fallout as time goes on. The next issue to address would be to establish a shelter to protect you from the extreme cold as the temperature begins to drop. This would require some fuel for heating and food to sustain you. The first week or so would likely be the time when food was most plentiful, with tinned foods being especially sought after since they last the longest and are least likely to get contaminated. In order to sustain yourself as long as possible, you would need to ration your food out, eating just enough to survive, and have enough energy to achieve necessary tasks. If you were to consider a well-stocked survivor consuming around 600 calories a day, that would translate into 1 full tin of baked beans and up to 3 pieces of bread. This is of course excluding water. While this might be enough to keep you alive, it would result in severe health problems over time. Activities to achieve survival would likely require a greater number of calories consumed, and this would lead to an energy deficiency in the body. This would likely cause the body to go into starvation mode, where it reduces the metabolism in order to store as many calories as possible for slower consumption. After a prolonged period of this, the body will start to cannibalize muscle tissue, which in turn would make activity even more difficult, and lead to periods of inactivity which could affect your survival prospects if your shelter becomes damaged, requiring repair. Your body will also begin to be starved of vital vitamins, such as vitamin A, C and E, which are essential for your immune system. No matter how well you stock up supplies prior to the outbreak of war, you will eventually need to source new supplies, but once manufactured foods are exhausted, your chances are extremely low. As we have discussed already, the cold and lack of sufficient sunlight will have started to kill off edible plants, which in turn would starve any surviving animals to death. Any rain that would fall would only do more harm, since it would likely be contaminated and contain radioactive dust particles, making it appear black in colour. Worse still for the long term, insects vital to pollinization, such as bees, would have died off in great numbers, reducing the chances of wide-scale recovery of the land. Clean water would be just as difficult to find, with man-made water sources such as through water pipes and treatment centres to your taps being destroyed. Even if you found a stream located in an area devoid of fallout, it's likely that the water would have been exposed to radioactive particles at some time, as it made its way down through the mountains towards the sea. The result of all this is clear. There would be a famine amongst the survivors in the months after the nuclear attacks. Desperation would almost certainly lead people to consuming irradiated water, crops and animals, which would lead to severe medical problems and ultimately death. As if all this wasn't enough, diseases such as cholera and typhoid would run rampant because of the lack of clean drinking water and medical treatment. In the early 1980s, a British think tank estimated that in mainland Britain, the population could fall as low as 4 million people in the aftermath of a nuclear war against the country, half the population of London in 2016. The key to survival in this period would lay in cooperation amongst groups of survivors. They would have to form themselves into small communities where each member contributes something to the survival of the whole, which means those who are ill or severely injured would probably be cast out or even euthanized, so as not to drain resources or infect others. Even if the central government survived the nuclear attack, they may as well be destroyed as far as the survivors are concerned, since there would be little they could do to help them. To that end, the group would have to create their own hierarchy and establish a survival plan that takes into account their own skills, resources, nearby food sources, and knowledge of known heavily irradiated areas, and groups of other survivors they could work with. Unfortunately, there are 2 main inhibitors that would stand in the way of this collective survival. Firstly, the lack of communications equipment. Transportation and the capacity for scientific analysis would severely hinder the ability to function safely within the radioactive environment. Most pieces of technology would have been rendered useless by the electromagnetic pulses generated by the nuclear detonations. And even if they were still working, then there is the question of powering them, with there being little to no reliable electrical sources to utilize. This means that survivors will have to make educated guesses as to how irradiated an area is, based on observation alone, while the lack of communication tools will also make it difficult to communicate with other groups of survivors, who may have items or even knowledge necessary for your survival. The second main inhibitor to collective survival would actually be the psychological effects of what has happened amongst the survivors. Witnessing the effect of a nuclear war could cause severe emotional and psychological trauma that would greatly disrupt a person's survival efforts in the crucial first few days after the attack. Most survivors of major disasters experience overwhelming feelings of loss, not just for the people who may have been killed, but for the loss of how they view the world. You may still be living in your own house after the attack, but how you perceive both it and the world outside may be radically different, forcing you to readjust, something that comes easier to some than others. Those who cannot adjust will sometimes retreat into their minds rather than deal with what is in front of them, or alternatively, take their own lives. Even those who try to tackle their new surroundings with a sense of defiance will have to deal with some level of psychological damage. It's likely that survivors will suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, which will affect their ability to function as they lose sleep and their appetite, which would lead to physical illnesses and suffer from flashbacks of the nuclear attack. Some will even experience deep levels of guilt over surviving when their loved ones may not have, which affects concentration levels. Regarding the idea of collective survival, a traumatized survivor's ability to interact with other people will be severely affected by what they would have seen and experienced since the attack. An emotionally unstable person may inhibit a group's ability to function, and the lack of cohesion amongst the members of the community. This can foster a feeling of paranoia, which can then manifest in physical violence towards other members of the group, who will have to take action against that person. Afterwards, the feeling of paranoia would remain and would actually spread as others begin to wonder if more could break and attack them, or even if they acted in an unpopular way, would they then be cast out of the group. If your group of survivors managed to organise themselves and develop a piece of land to an extent with which you could live off, what would the future hold for you long term? Nobody really knows how long the nuclear winter would last, since it would depend on the extent of nuclear weapons used, and the types of fuel sources that would be ignited in the blast, but it would likely last at least 1 year. As the black cloud began to break away, the threat of intense levels of ultraviolet radiation from the sun would start to take its toll on the planet after the depletion of the ozone layer, which would take years to repair. Disease and the risk of contamination would remain for the rest of your life, which would be cut significantly shorter because of the lack of sophisticated medical assistance. Living off the land, there would be a constant fear that the next harvest would fail and the community would starve to death. Finally, for the generations to come next, they would inherit the hardship, cancer, disease, and gestational malformations that would arise from the irradiated world they were born into. And it would all be because someone had pushed a button. Is this the only World War III? This is the kind of nightmare scenario we tend to conjure up when someone mentions World War III or nuclear war. However, the nature of global warfare extends beyond this one dark doomsday scenario. Biological weaponry offers as much potential for disaster as nuclear, but unlike nuclear weaponry, a population may not even be aware that an attack has taken place. The use of diseases as a weapon to attack a population goes back to ancient history. Records from 1500 BC in Turkey tell of sufferers of what is now called tularemia, a serious infectious disease that causes fever and swelling of the lymph nodes, as well as pneumonia, being transported into lands that have been earmarked for invasions later. The idea was to kill or weaken the men who would take up arms to defend their land when the invasion finally came. The Mongol Empire transported rodents infected with bubonic plague as they invaded deeper into China throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. These rodents then infected local rodents, who in turn spread it to the local population, and this contributed to the estimated 25 million deaths in China attributed to plague in this period. The fear during the Cold War amongst the American and British intelligence agencies was that the Soviets would use airliners or ships to clandestinely infect huge areas of territory in the build-up to all-out war. The resulting epidemic would kill large numbers of people, spreading fear amongst the population, and distracting them and their leaders from actions that the Soviets were undertaking to prepare to strike. It would also cause political and economic upheaval, which would further hamper the targeted country's ability to respond to an invasion. To investigate how the Soviets, or even they themselves, might carry out such an attack, both the US and UK carried out a series of tests in the 1950s and 1960s, during which their own populations sometimes being unknowingly test subjects. In 1952, the UK government began Operation Cauldron, headed by the covert research team based at Porton Down, which involved releasing biological agents against caged animals on an exposed barge off the Isle of Lewis. Some of the agents used during the tests included pneumonic and bubonic plague, brucellosis and tularemia. During the course of the trials, a British fishing trawler, the Karela, strayed into the test area, and it was feared that the crew had become infected with plague. The Royal Navy clandestinely tracked the trawler for over 2 weeks to monitor the crew for signs of illness, and if they did develop symptoms, then a destroyer had ordered to seize the ship and crew to prevent them infecting the greater British population. Fortunately, the crew escaped infection, but the operation was so secret that it would not be until 50 years later that the trawler crew were made aware of the potential danger they were in, and that they had been tracked by Royal Navy destroyers. The US began their formal biological weapons program in the very early 50s, but US scientists had been mulling over data captured from Japanese wartime Unit 731 Biological Warfare Research Team from as early as 1946. The data Unit 731 provided the US was deemed invaluable because, unlike the US scientists, the Japanese had no reservations about using live human beings, mostly Chinese civilians, in brutal tests and experiments. In September 1950, the US Navy conducted Operation Sea Spray, in which supposedly harmless bacteria spores were released off the shore of San Francisco Bay towards the city to simulate a Soviet biological attack. 43 monitoring stations were set up across the city to measure how well they spread, and it's estimated that up to 800,000 people were exposed to them at some point. There have been numerous suggestions that the test resulted in a number of health problems amongst residents, and even a handful of deaths, although these haven't been proven. The UK carried out similar tests involving a secret ship, the Ice Whale, and a converted Canberra bomber during the 1960s, in which over 1 million UK residents over the southwest of England were at some point exposed to the released bacteria. One can just imagine the horror that would arise if the bacteria released were deliberately harmful. While we may look back on these tests in the 1950s and 60s with disgust, we must also accept that in a world of increasingly sophisticated terrorism who have access to biological and chemical weapons, these tests helped formulate measures to counter such attacks. There is an obvious problem for any nation that wishes to use biological weaponry to weaken an enemy prior to invasion, and that is the risk of infecting their own troops and people. Unlike nuclear fallout, bacteria pathogens can be cleansed from an infected area, but if this was a highly infectious disease, then there is always the risk that rodents or even people might carry it into other areas, spreading it beyond the intended target area. While we commonly refer to World War III taking place between nations, it could also be that World War III would actually take place between ideologies rather than resources or land borders. The rise of religious extremism, such as Islamic State, transcends physical boundaries thanks to the internet, which they can use to recruit and train new members for carrying out targets against those of different beliefs and culture, in the place they feel most safe, their own towns and cities. Most worryingly, the leaders of such groups don't even have to communicate directly with potential new operatives. They need only to inspire them to carry out attacks in their name. Islamic State alone has either directed or inspired attacks in 22 countries since 2014, making them a truly global threat to the West. Combating a global ideological force is an extremely difficult thing to do. Being based on an idea rather than a specific organization, you cannot destroy its ability to function in the same way you could an enemy army. While military strikes, such as we have seen being carried out by US, British and French aircraft over Syria and Iraq against Islamic State, will inhibit such organizations' ability to hold land, over which they can impose their ideological will, it does not remove the threat of so-called homegrown terrorism. Only a concentrated effort to suppress the violent ideological message, in place of one embracing life, will end such terrorism. But that effort itself would be seen as the oppression of their ideology they hold so dearly and actually encourage more terrorism. Finally, in the 21st century, the threat of a new kind of weapon to wage a global war emerged, and it continues to loom over all of us like the threat of a mushroom cloud hung over the generations that grew up in the Cold War. It has no discernible size or shape, and does not distinguish between the young, the old, the healthy, the innocent, or the guilty. And whether you know it or not, you are already a soldier on the front lines while you sit and watch this documentary. This war takes place entirely online, and it can be argued that not only is it already raging, but has the potential to be just as destructive as any weapon in the physical world. Never before in history has humanity been so intertwined as it is now, thanks to the internet. Every day, more and more aspects of our life gets converted into digital information and held in cyberspace. Think of anything you have done in the last 24 hours, and chances are it's left some kind of digital footprint. Purchased groceries, your bank will record how much they cost and where you bought them on their servers. Been to the hospital, your health service provider will record and share your medical history with their central computers. So how then is this information a weakness to us? Your life is built around the technology that allows you to live it in the 21st century, and the data on your technology holds. Imagine then, someone highlighted every piece of digital information about you, and then hit delete. How would you buy food with no bank details? How would the doctor know if a medication is safe for you to use without checking your medical history? How would you even identify yourself to someone if none of your forms of physical ID is backed up with a digital file from the relevant organisation? But it gets worse. Computers now control so many parts of our civilization, our power stations, water supply, warships, aircraft, and even our cars, that if they were accessed externally by a hostile force, they could be rendered completely useless, the results of which would be catastrophic. This is the realm of cyber warfare. What was once the privy of just a few hacking groups has now become a global phenomenon embraced by world governments and corporations to better their positions in the real world. When it emerged, the internet was merely an online encyclopedia and an extension of the telephone, but now it directly impacts our everyday lives. So just who is wrestling to control or destroy our lives online? Just like in the real world, there are online superpowers who control large areas of the internet, and as such, wield an exceptional level of power in the real world. If you type a question into Google, it's the algorithm designed to meet Google's own rules and regulations that dictate what answer you get. You are therefore seeing your world through their filtered view they are offering you. This is not to say Google has some insidious plan for world domination, but rather they are an example of how an online power can, for good or bad, dictate decisions you make in the real world. In the lead up to the 2016 US presidential debate, Google and Facebook both came under fire for being accused of unfairly influencing the information coming out about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. The greater level of interaction an online provider can convince you to undertake with them, then the greater the power they wield to influence you. More often than not, they use this influence to simply try to sell you something. But if one of these service providers had political motivations across the world, then they could bombard you with information that would actually encourage you to achieve their goals for them. In recent years, a number of uprisings, such as in Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine, and the Arab Spring, have been seen, at least fueled by information being pumped into the country from an outside source with their own agenda. On the other side of the coin, however, there is a far less subversive method of using cyberspace to wage war. Aggressive hacking with the intention of successfully disturbing a country's ability to function is now not only a possibility, but every bit as great a threat as, say, an airstrike. The world was given just a taste of what such an attack could do, when on May 12, 2017, over 100 countries were hit in a massive cybersecurity attack using ransomware that is designed to extort money out of people. Not even the most sophisticated countries like the United States, UK, France and Russia were unaffected, with perhaps the most significant victim being England's National Health Service, which saw life-saving operations cancelled on an unprecedented scale. The ransomware used in the attack was unleashed by a group of well-organised and equipped criminals, but it does demonstrate how feasible it would be for a government to unleash such an attack against a hostile country. The fear is that a supervirus could be developed that could bypass firewall protection software and would infect computers across an entire country through their broadband or Wi-Fi connection and render them useless. The supervirus could also disrupt communications or even feed false information into the system to further inhibit a country's ability to recover. The result would be an almost complete collapse of that country's economy, health, security, and even government services. And while the country may be able to recover, it would take time and leave the country vulnerable. If the supervirus was designed to target several countries or even entire continents like Europe and Asia, World War III could be over in just a few hours, without the victorious nation having fired a single shot. You may be wondering now, just how has humanity managed to survive as long as it has, with so many ways in which it can destroy itself? The fact is that for every one individual or group who have violent or in some way destructive intent towards us, there are a number of people, groups, organisations and governments working to counter them. These think tanks spend their time trying to conceive of the many possible ways we may be threatened in the future, and what we can do to stop them, or at least limit the damage. They may not get it right all the time, and there will always be those who find a way to bypass our most sophisticated defences. But when that happens, past and even recent experience has shown that this is where we come together the most. Hate is never as powerful as love and respect. As for nuclear weapons, an odd fact surrounding their existence is that they have prevented an all-out war between the superpowers for over 70 years. Even when the world came closest to open warfare during the Cold War, namely the Cuban Missile Crisis, the threat they posed to humanity itself brought us back from the brink. Certainly, the world would be safer if they were not needed, but until humanity goes through a major evolutionary shift away from violence, they will have their purpose in the world. But we can't exist forever living under the threat of violence. We must remember that the world is full of individuals, and the loss of just one life is a great loss to the whole. When we all come to realise the value of life, we will all work harder towards preserving it. And besides, the biggest threat to humanity may be right under our nose.